The question that we started with for this conference is questions of signs of modernity, that is, signs of early modernity, definitions of early modernity. The text that I want to use is a text that in many ways harks back to things that each of us, or many of us, have talked about. It is, like Ted's text, a Musar text, or an ethical text, or a popular text, in the sense that it is written to try to tell people how to behave. It's written in Hebrew. It is an unnamed, it is an anonymous text, in the sense that it was published only once. Well, no, that's not true. It was published a second time, but in our period, it was published only once. It was published in Prague sometime before 1650, and it was published anonymously. There was a tradition, which in fact has been confirmed, I think, fairly effectively by recent scholarship, that it was in fact the product of Rabbi Samuel ben Abraham Aboab, a rabbi in Venice, Verona and then Venice, which raises the question of why it was published in Prague, why it was published anonymously, not in a very particularly nice edition.
Sorry, are you sure it's published in Prague?
That's also not sure. That's the usual assign. You're quite right. I'm sorry. It's usually assigned to be a Prague thing. The basic writing about this text, the people who have really written about it, there is a very lovely, if you know what I mean, from the edition, but it's really quite a nicely done job with a very nice introduction. No, it's a nice job with the limitations of that kind of thing. It's called Sefer Zikhronot. I'll try to get to the meaning of that in a minute. That came out a couple of years ago in Jerusalem, in which I recommend to everybody. And that's what the scan is from. And the other scholarship about the other main thing about the book is the parts of Meir ben Yahu's Dor Echad Ba'aretz, which is a reworking of his earlier articles about the correspondence. He found several Igwanim, volume one of Samuel Aboab and one of Moshe Zakut, and he published them many, many years ago and then reworked them into a book, primarily focusing on Sfat and what's going on in Eretz Israel, but he has a very lengthy section in there about Samuel Aboab and so forth. Okay, now much has been written about the question of conversion and identity formation among the conversos of the early modern period. Some of the issues that Ron raised before, about identity and conversion and space and things like that, they are especially acute about the conversos. Their identity is one that sort of moves. They're always negotiating the minefields of Christian law, both canonical and secular. Their identity is shaped by multiple opportunities offered by conversion itself, by participation in expanding imperial enterprises, by migration. These are sort of the poster boys for the mixed identities and confusions of early modernity. I think if I had to sum up very quickly the kind of scholarship trend that has gone on about converso identity over the last 100 years, we've moved from a sense of fixed identities, they either were Jews or they weren't Jews, to a kind of understanding of a fluidity of imposed identity categories. In other words, they move between identities and their own sense of self changes fairly often. There's essentially a malleability of their self-definition. We moved, in other words, well beyond the black and white categories of Netanyahu and Rivkin, the old arguments about the validity of inquisitorial documents. Lois and I sat through Yosef Yerushalmi's lectures about how these guys had obviously missed everything. It's in the introduction to the Cardozo book, and he argued that you had to look at the categories of the inquisitorial documents on another level. He talked about a spectrum of identities, and I think, quite frankly, we've gone beyond that too. I think that most recent scholarship talks about the inquisitorial documents themselves as constructed documents, as very often observing or defining things that were different than, or that were not necessarily what the inquisitors observed, and the like. So, we talk about multiple and flexible identities, Brian Pullen's famous line about a ship with two rudders, but these people are people who move between worlds. Having said that, it is not necessarily true, no matter how fluid their identity is, it's not true that they didn't try to create fixed points of identity. And in fact, that's a large part of what Yossi Kaplan has done over the years, is to talk how in Amsterdam it was absolutely crucial to fix identity, specifically because people weren't coming with living traditions, weren't coming with inherited identities, but that identity had to be created. So it became very important to define identity, to establish limits that perhaps in communities that had not gone through the disjunction of conversion and so forth wouldn't have been as important. Miriam Bodian, in her book on the Jews in Amsterdam, talks about the re-Judaization. She has a chapter on the re-Judaization of the nation, and she talks about those common values that the community tried to establish as defining what is a Jew. Right? What is required for us to belong to the community? I would like to add to that kind of discourse another discourse, which I think is very important, and that is the legal definition of what a Jew is. In my own work on charters in Italy, and this is work that includes Ancona and Livorno and Rome, and the papal system, I would argue that one of the characteristics, and it is echoed, in the system of Kehilot in the Ottoman Empire, but in Italy, we can actually see something very important. The state reinforces ethnic identities of Jews by issuing multiple charters to the same Jewish community. This is a characteristic of the early modern period that I do not think existed before. In other words, what you have is the state, for example, Venice, issuing one charter to one group of Jews and another charter to another group of Jews. And it becomes very important to define your group identity within the Jewish community because your legal status depends on it. And everybody knows that there is tremendous antipathy and hostility, of course, not in Rome, where they all married each other at a higher rate than even in Eretz Yisrael like Elisha. But all I'm saying is this, even that this issue of intermarriage, which can raise, and there's an old standing fight or dispute, whatever, about the nature of things in Rome. I'm not trying to go into that, although that's something separate. But in the Italian city-states of the 16th century, we get a phenomenon where the state licenses ethnic identity. And there is a reinforcement of sub-identity by that issue of legal status. I don't think that has nearly enough been addressed in understanding identity issues within Jewish communities. Let me go on to the next thing.
Is that different from the privileges that Adam introduced yesterday?
Well, in fact, the privileges that Adam presents, I think, are part of a tradition that I think I can date the beginning of at approximately 1514, but certainly 1532 in the Papal States. I think, by the way, that it's part of the same tradition as the Lettres Patentes in France, which are issued to specific groups of new Christians. We know, I can show that London was studying these documents as precedents to what's going on. I can show that in Antwerp, the definitions of charters were done. So, in fact, I think it is very broad, but that's new. This was not the kind of thing you have, let's say, with a condotta in the Middle Ages, where an individual and a group of Jews are allowed to come somewhere. Or the original charters in Poland, which were not given to one group of Jews and then a different charter was given to a different group of Jews, but rather the Jews are given a charter. And this also is related to the fact that the medieval community is a one kahal, one city arrangement. The early modern period, you have multiple kehillot for many reasons. But certainly in the Ottoman Empire, it's linked to tax policy. The question whether it's linked to Jewish tax policy or Ottoman tax policy is another question that I can't answer. But the point is that in the early modern period, we get breakups of the community into multiple communities that are defined by ethnicity in that sense of Jewish, the group you belong to, by your language possibly, by your place of origin, by all kinds of things. And it becomes very important for Jews to define that. And I can show that. I can demonstrate it. The point of all of this is as follows. If identity on the one hand is fluid, and that's a characteristic of the early modern period, for conversos in particular. They themselves are trying to fix identity, I said in a cultural sense, Miriam Bodian, but in addition, the law is fixing identity, and that creates a new level. And the third level here is that I would argue that part of the process of recreating structure, of making things work, is social discipline. And this was the point, of course, that I was raising before. That is
that all communities or communities?
Well, I think it is particularly true. I'm willing to say it here for conversos, but of course, this is part of much of the argument about the nature of the early modern period, that there is a kind of a social discipline being enforced because the state wants it, the state is large enough to do it, because the tools are available. That's a whole complicated thing. We're only going to look at a document, but that's the issue I'm laying on the table. That is what's going on. And the text I want us to look at is the Sefer Zikhronot, because it is, in fact, an attempt to create a very strong sense of social uniformity or religious uniformity. And I would argue, now remember, this text is written sometime in the middle of the 17th century, right? And it's written by a man who, I'll tell you a little bit about him in just a second, but we're not talking about somebody who came out of Portugal, right? We're talking about somebody who lived his entire life, he was born in Hamburg, but he came to Venice at age 13 to study in yeshiva. He stayed basically in that area for his entire life, and he died, I would argue, the most respected rabbi in Venice, even though he is of one particular Eidah. But the descriptions of him and so forth are overwhelming. So this book represents a specific moment in the middle of the 17th century in the Portuguese community, but in the broader Venetian community in general. Now, I was originally interested in the Sefer Zikhronot because I was interested in Aboab as compared to Modena. I wanted to compare these two people, that is Yehuda Aryeh Modena and Shmuel Aboab. They overlap a little. Yehuda Aryeh Modena is the earlier of the two. But Yehuda Aryeh Modena, who should have been the great hero of Venetian Jewry, he should have been the greatest rabbi by his knowledge, by his wit, by his ability to be cross-cultural and so forth and so on. In fact, after an early success, he comes into the city as a young man, he's giving sermons, he's publishing his sermons when he's still a tzutzik, a young guy, and then the rest of his life is basically a life of failure. It can be traced by the levels of house that he lives in. He's always moving down. And if you know Italian cities, the fact that he ends his life living on a ground floor apartment in Venice really tells you something. I mean, that's bad. He's addicted to gambling. His children are gang members, are killed in front of him, are exiled from the city. After he dies, one of his sons comes back to grab as many of his father's manuscripts as he can so he can sell them. I mean, this is not a lot of nachas, it ain't great. But that is Modena. And Modena is, in that sense, extremely interesting because he is a failure. On the other hand, Aboab is extremely fascinating because he's the exact opposite. He's a man who comes into Venice as an outsider, as a kid. He grows up there. He leaves. He has to live in the community of Sfardim in Verona, where he's the rabbi for much of his life, is really a know-nothing, tiny little community. They meet in a hayloft or something in an attic. But he comes back to Venice as a success in his funeral and so forth. I think, by the way, another characteristic of the early modern period that has been touched on here and that I think deserves mention in this particular case, and one of the reasons I was interested in comparing the two, Modena writes his memoir. It's not really an autobiography. It's not exactly a memoir. It's not really a diary. But he writes that book after the death of his oldest son. And he says, I'm depressed. Now, that's a very common motive for writing. Gluckel says she's depressed and writes her thing because she's alone and lonely and old and so forth and so on. And this is very common. It's a therapeutic thing. Nicha. But there's another thing going on. If you look at Aboab's Dvar Shmuel, the introduction to the Dvar Shmuel, which is a collection of his tshuvot, is a paean to the father by the son. One of the sons writes this lengthy biography of his father. You have to remember that until the middle of the 16th century, the idea of biographies of Jews was not an obvious thing. When Chizketo has to write that thing about Abravanel at the beginning of, what is it, I think the commentary on Malachim, and he writes, is it, which, huh? No. Chizketo writes the introduction to the Perush on, it's not Yeshua, Mashiach. All right. I trust your judgment better than your memory, much better than mine. But when he writes it, he has to justify the introduction, telling you who Abravanel is, because maybe by reading this, maybe you'll want to read the book, right? But it's not obvious that you should know who a rabbi was. By the time you get to the 17th century, the biography and the biography of a rabbi, in fact, the publication of a book is an act of loyalty by the child. It is a method of memorializing your parent. The book has become a memorial. It has become an act of respect. And the death, I would submit that one of the reasons why he wrote the diary after his son died, why Yehuda wrote the diary after his son died, was because he knew that nobody was going to do it for him. That in fact, that option was gone. So Yehuda Aryeh wrote this thing because no one else was going to do it for him. That we could argue about that, but I think there's an element of that. Let me throw in yet one other element here of the early modernness of this, if biography and social discipline and so forth. I would like to throw in, and let me summarize that by saying that, in other words, what I had in mind for Aboab is to look at the relationship between individual identity and ethnicity. In other words, I mentioned the ethnicity as part of the formation of identity in this period. I think that, in fact, is one of the characteristics of the early modern period, that we can begin looking at subgroups of Jews, right, who may live very close to each other, and yet who nevertheless bear separate, and I don't know if ethnicity is the right word to use, but a separate cultural baggage, which defines them separately. And this, again, I think is something, I mean, we can certainly talk about new immigrants to cities in the Middle Ages who worry about local minhag. It's not that there were not conflicts in the Middle Ages and earlier, but this is institutionalized and recognized and continues for time. And so I think this is a characteristic of the period. Now, the last element here in terms of early modern that I want to talk about is, and then we'll get to the text, is the idea that there is rupture and reconstruction, right? I do not think, the interesting thing about Aboab is that whatever Kabbalistic orientation he had, he is not primarily a Kabbalist. That is, his writing is not Kabbalistic, and there's virtually nothing Kabbalistic in this text, in the Sefer Zikhronot. What he is a ritualistic enthusiast. He is absolutely obsessed with finding chumrot, with making things harder, with being stricter. Not that this rings any bells for any of us here, but he is one of these people who absolutely refuses to find any way to legitimize a behavior, if there is any way whatsoever to forbid it. And he is that, when I say social control, I want you to understand that this is a creative process of restructuring behavior. He seeks not just to slap little kids, he wants to slap everybody. He wants to make everybody shape up, and he wants to structure the things. Let me give you just a couple of examples that I couldn't put in the text here, but just to give you a sense of it. Let me read you a couple of passages from Aboab, not the passage I gave you, but a couple, just to give you a sense. And some of you may tell me, this is not an enthusiast, this is normal. but I don't think it is. He's talking about Shabbat at one point, and he says, beloved is Israel, who are called children of the divine. We in ancient and modern times have been given a special love by our Father in heaven through 3 wonderful signs, Shabbat and Tefillin and Brit, so forth and so on. All very typical. The book is written in very traditional language. He's using standard quotations, and he does all these things. These are the things. Now listen. Therefore, it would be proper for, they announce and declare these 3 signs, Shabbat, phylacteries, and Brit, and circumcision. They announce and declare in public that the Lord our God chose us from all nations, and we are forever his eternal, delightful plant. Netashashuah. Very nice. Therefore, it would be proper for us to carefully and cleanly keep the form and character of these commandments, as they were first given to us in sanctity and purity. But we have sinned, and our sins have taken away from their perfection and have introduced flaws in their glory and beauty. In other words, he has the sense of we aren't doing it right anymore. Our observance, our practice is not the way it's supposed to be. Okay? There is a thing. So what does he tell people? He says, for example, don't wash your hands or eat anything with liquid while walking in a field on the Sabbath. Right? You have a plum, you go out in the field, don't eat, because it might drip and water the grass. And he suggests that the community post signs and even guards in areas likely to be visited on the Sabbath so that people are told, do not eat plums here, do not, don't spit. He extends this prohibition also to liquids such as wine. Even though people said, if you pour wine on grass, if you drop the wine on the grass, it'll burn the grass, he says that doesn't matter. Or even, you can't even urinate on Shabbos on the ground. Why? Because even if it doesn't make something grow, and even if you'll dig a hole in the ground by pishing. There are suggestions that he wanted to prevent gatherings of mixed company on the Sabbath, not just outside, but even indoors on moral grounds. He wants people to go over the laws of borer, of dividing foods over and over again. And he says, quite honestly, there's no way to ever really do it right. So if you want to eat 2 kinds of foods on Sabbath, keep them in 2 containers. There's absolutely no way to eat anything that is mixed together because you're going to screw up. He stresses that having a Gentile prepare food or other needs for the sick on the Sabbath is allowed only if there is a life-threatening disease. He says, for instance, that he knows you've got to be careful about dyeing cloth, but he says, quite frankly, it may be that it's also forbidden to dye your skin. So he says people can't eat strawberries on Sabbath because the red juice might dye your skin and so forth and so on. All right, you get the idea. I think that this indicates a kind of tone and so forth and so on. And when he finds something in Karo that appears to dismiss one of his new chumrot, he simply says that must be a misprint. That's, by the way, one of the implications of technology. You can dismiss everything on the grounds that the editor, the stupid printer did it, because no real scholar could possibly say this. And it's great. This is the consistent attitude in his book. I'll skip the other ones. Let's take a look at his text and talk about things. In general, he...
Are you absolutely certain that he wrote it?
Well, I'll tell you.
Because it was published anonymously later.
Maybe not.
Possible like other obsessive publishers.
Well, one could argue
My question is, he also authored by name Shalom.
Yes, and yes. For example, somebody comes to him with china. They're bringing china from China. That is, the china plates, right? These come to Venice. They say to him, these are perfectly smooth. Now, if you've ever looked at salt pottery, which was the standard form of clay pottery in those days, if you look at salt pottery, it's pitted, right? It's pocked. And there is no possibility of a smooth glazed finish. But if you look at a piece of china, and this was literally stuff from 1705 or something in Maryland. The china is as bright, even though it's, broken pieces, but it's as bright and as smooth as if you went to the department store to buy it today. The difference was extraordinary, and it must have been extraordinary for the Jews in Venice. So he has asked the question, can we eat milchiks and fleishiks on the same thing? This is smooth. And he bends over backwards to find a reason why, even though everything that I see in front of me proves It can't be. But even beyond that tshuva, which we could argue he's trying to preserve a way of life and so forth and so on, the introduction in this book and things that Benayahu did, you can actually find repeated phrases and phrasing. I wouldn't say 100% because I'm not basing it on my own minute comparison, but I'm content that the work has been done, that it's a pretty good chance that he wrote this. And by the way, that's the tradition. The tradition for hundreds of years is that he wrote it. Chida says everybody said it. You remember that thing about Shabbat? We had this beautiful Shabbat and it has been taken away or it has declined. There is a sense in him of a loss of an original purity. And what he always says he's trying to do is never innovate. In fact, he is intuitively and emotionally antagonistic to innovation, right? Even though much of what he does is an innovation, but he doesn't label it. No, it's not. But he needs to believe. In other words, for him, the goal is to go back to an older form. Now, my argument here is that this is early modern in another sense. What he's doing is, he is creating an image of, and this is a very modern term, and I apologize for it in the sense that he wouldn't have used this kind of word, but I think it's true. He is creating for his readers an image of an essential Judaism. That is, what he does is, he has none of the flexibility of looking, and he's a well-learned Talmudist. He is not an ignorant guy who just picked up a little bit here and there. He knows his stuff. He's a good writer. He was extremely well respected as a halachist in his day, as a halachic authority. But there is no sense in reading his tshuvot of a sense of, well, there's been this debate and there was that view and there's this view and we're taking this thing. There is always this sense of we're going to go back to the way it really was. That is this creation of a static image of the Judaism that has to be found again. And that, I think, is part of this process. So let's look at a couple of examples. He begins this thing. It's rather curious to see. Concerning admonition, tochacha, or tochacha, right? Now, he starts out here. It says, the main point of proper study of the Torah, that which is precious in the eyes of our sages, is to study and to teach. Right? Now, there's nothing unusual about that. And in fact, that line appears to be fairly odd when you see it at the beginning because, you don't know what he's doing here. And it doesn't seem to have to do anything with the rest of the thing. But he sets up in the first few paragraphs, he's actually a very careful writer. He sets up the idea that just learning is not enough. And he uses the old standard dichotomy of, Torah and Maaseh, or Mishnah and Maaseh, and he puts it in here. And he sort of leaves it there, that Maaseh that Maaseh is the Ikar, and that Torah is only good because it leads to Maaseh. In other words, the superiority of learning is that it will also get you to deed, to action. Okay, so he sets that up, and he leaves it. So now if you go down to page 2, he says, it is clear, this is the first full paragraph, it is clear that just as teachers are obligated to teach their students well and properly, and to supervise them well in all their doings, it is doubly incumbent on each rabbi in his community to supervise all affairs of the community or congregations directly under his control. So he sets up, again, this image of the rabbi, not the community leaders. Don't forget, Venice had a very strong lay leadership. But he makes the point that it's the rabbi's job, and the rabbi is not just a teacher. The rabbi is also a supervisor. Okay? That's the second point. This need to sort of control, to do things for your students, whether private or public. You have to supervise it, for you are the father and the rabbi of all members of your city or community. So he has this image of the rabbi as a supervisor of behavior in the community.
This is very parallel to the Christian, the role of the priest, that he becomes responsible for
what's going on. Good. Good. Okay, so that may be well where he's getting it from. Now then he introduces a nice story. The story of the Kohen Gadol, who, if somebody kills by accident, he goes to the Ir Miklat. He goes to the city of refuge, according to biblical law. He can't leave the city of refuge until the Kohen Gadol dies, right? And then there'll be a general amnesty and he can leave. So the wives of the Kohen Gadol would bring food to the people in the Ir Miklat, so they wouldn't pray that the guy should die, because, so they can get out. All right. It says, now, why should the Kohen Gadol be, in some way, why should his life be responsible, linked to this? Because even though it was an accident, and even though they didn't know anything about it, it was their job to stop it. They should have prayed to God. They should have been involved to keep society pure. And because they didn't, their life is now, in effect, on the line for the corruption of society. So here you have really a very powerful image. It may be a little bit far-fetched, but it wouldn't have appeared to them as far-fetched. And I think it is a powerful image to give you this image of the rabbi as the Kohen Gadol, who is ultimately responsible for everything in his community. He goes on with a story about Samuel, which we can skip, and we go on now to page 4. Full paragraph. I have copied out all of these texts about the responsibility, so the person, there's a typo, so that a person cannot say, what can I do about this problem? People won't accept reproach from me. Maybe the rabbi will say, I tried. No one will listen to me. You can only use that excuse, he says, in a situation where it is certain that the people will not accept your words. In such circumstances, we say, leave the Jewish people alone. It is better that they sin in error than in full knowledge. This argument that Hanach L'Am Yisrael allowed the Jews to sin in ignorance, because if we tell them that it's wrong and we know they're going to do it anyway, then it's bad. But he said, and he basically now for the next couple of pages is going to restrict the legitimacy of that self-indulgence of rabbis to say, what can I do? That's the nature of my community. He basically finds every way possible to say, you can't do that. Forget it. Your job is to open your mouth and nag everybody all the time, non-stop, unendingly, to get them to be good Jews. And then he does something else that is very interesting. He says you have to judge how far you can do it and what is the best way, but now on page 6. It is clear that a person does not fulfill his obligation by delivering a public sermon or two. Here it's clear he's talking to rabbis. And he says to them, Chevra, you gave a sermon about some issue in your community. You think that's enough? Shkach mizeh. Forget it. It doesn't work. You have to do it over and over again. And then he gives us a very interesting sort of view of the people. He says, not everyone attends sermons, and those who do come don't necessarily pay attention. And even if they do listen to you, they don't necessarily understand. And even if they understand, they won't necessarily repent immediately. The oivei is Bavonotenu Arabim. I didn't know how to translate Bavonotenu because of our great sins. Sounded a little odd in English, so I put it as woe is us. But oivei would have worked. This is not to say that public sermons are useless. Of course, he doesn't want to do away with public sermons. Sermons should be given, and it shouldn't be abandoned. But the preacher, you just shouldn't, you should have the right idea in mind. But in addition to such public reprimand, we must not desist from private admonition. And he says that people call Jews into them or actually go out to find the sinners. We have this image of, the involved Christian missionary out there on the streets, the Salvation Army guy, going out there to the drunks to save their souls. And
this reads to me is not like rabbis. This reads to me as in fact he's moved down from the rabbis to different stratum of society.
Well, he actually is going to say something about another stratum. I'm not sure. I think what he means here, it starts out that I have seen righteous people.
That's quite normal.
Yeah. No, I think these are. In fact, he's going to talk about other people, but
Christian preachers saying that people go to church, they don't come to church. If they come, they don't pay attention. They talk to each other.
I can't think of another example of a description of what's wrong with the community. Like I literally, I've never come across another example quite this down to earth about.
Since I say it, preachers are always concerned that nobody's.
Well, I know, but I can't. Okay, I mean, we can see this as simply.
That's interesting here. The Sephardi person states it.
Okay,
it's very different in Ashkenazi culture and Sephardi culture. The attitude toward the sermon. It's totally different. Ashkenazi people dislike it and really run away from it. Sephardi rabbis were forced to do it at least 3 times on one Shabbat, which is really a serious problem. And people like it. And if there was a rabbi who wasn't good at sermon, he didn't survive. So it's a whole... Yeah, that's right. So it's a whole different attitude. It's a whole different attitude.
All right.
Therefore, if he says it, it's much more than if an Ashkenazi rabbi says it.
And Isaiah was definitely an Ashkenazi reading.
Is it only the rabbi that gives them to the community?
Yes, only rabbi, and they were hired.
No, but that didn't prove for no one else.
Right, and what you got was some people who were hired by more than one kihila because they were good sermon givers, and so like in Modena gives sermons in several places.
That's true, but he had to have the permit of the rabbi of the community to make this sermon.
Right.
That was his privilege. He could have passed it to somebody else.
Okay.
But it's his.
Page 7, line 5, further hours and days are needed with each person to warn him and encourage him. In other words, it's not enough just to give a public sermon. You got to work with people. You got to hear and respond to the details of your sin. It's almost like you got to hear confession. You got to make him realize the truth to enable him to repent so that he may go in peace and inner happiness. If you don't call this social discipline or social, the internalization of the values of the society, the need to be engaged in this, I just find it just very strong. I don't know what else I could call it. All right, then he goes on and he says there are 3 kinds of sins. There is sins of speech and sins of thought and sins of action. And it's interesting to go and look at what these are, but we'll skip it. And he goes down here, this is on page 9. The preacher must also call periodically on all the various craftsmen, such as slaughterers, checkers of animals, bodkim, right, the shochet and the bodek, the slaughterer or the person who will check the animal, porgers, people who take the veins out, the sciatic nerve, overseers of milking and the making of cheeses and wine, tailors and barbers. He has a whole section about how you have to cut your hair, whole section about tailors. He has this whole thing opposing the borrowing of clothes to dress up on Purim, not just because he says there's an isur of men wearing women's clothes and so forth. He says that's absolutely forbidden. This heter is ridiculous and I reject it. But also because what they do is they go to the pawnbrokers and they borrow people's clothing that are non-Jewish clothing. In other words, they get dressed up in non-Jewish costumes, and it's shatnez. That is, it's linsey woolsey, right? It's the mixed thing. And he said, this is asur. You can't do that. You can't, right? He's got the whole thing. And he wants the rabbi to become an OU supervisor of everything. He wants him involved in everything. He wants him checking the lettuce. He wants him checking for worms. He wants him checking for everything. And he says, you have to teach these craftsmen, these Baalei Melacha, the main points of their obligation, remind them to take precautions, for these are the ones who allow the public to be righteous. They are the Matzdikei Rabim. That's not such a great translation, but it seemed to work. And the entire community relies upon them, and so forth and so on. And so you get the feeling. Okay, I'm coming to the end. Now we come to the pièce de résistance. He comes to the Anusim. If you take a look on this starts on page 10, the last paragraph. All the more so is this true concerning our brethren, the children of Israel, who come from the lands of the diaspora and who neither know nor have they seen the path on which Jews must walk. Here what you have is a real confrontation with the reality of bringing Jews back into the fold. In other words, not convincing them to come. That's a separate issue. But actually creating the minutiae of their day-to-day life. And he makes the point that these people do not have the practice of living a Jewish life. And he puts it in very interesting ways. We must especially teach and encourage them, make them aware of the truth and show them the path, and so forth. I've already heard pious and scholarly and wise people expressing sorrow about the lack of diligence concerning this in a knowledgeable and wise people. Truthfully, every Jewish city should have a special chevra, special confraternity devoted to this, parallel to the many confraternities for all kinds of other things. This should not be overlooked. It should be the foundation stone. Those who come from slavery to redemption of the soul, from gloom and deepest darkness into the bright light of the Torah that enlightens the eyes, may the Redeemer and Savior be praised and glorified. What can they do when they come and there is no one to teach them, as is proper, the main principles of the faith and the main commandments? And he gives you examples. They don't know about forbidden foods. What kind of clothing may be worn, keeping the Sabbath and holy days, the demands of sanctity and purity that go along with them. As things come up concerning these commandments, men and women, this was a very interesting thing. They asked their neighbors who perform them by rote. In other words, Jews who have grown up in the system do it by rote. Mitzvat hanashim v'nashim melumadot. It's interesting he uses both genders, which is... Right. But it's a phrase that's used about rote behavior, but he includes women because he wants to say that women should be doing this too. It's not just a mitzvah on men to go out and teach other men. Women should be going out. This chevra idea is not just a male thing, it is a female thing as well. Often there is something of a gap between the knowledge level of the asker and the responder and so forth and so on. And here we come to something parallel to what Ted was saying. On page 12, he said, again, there should be a sacred confraternity. And then he says, this is in the middle of the big paragraph on page 12, they should have the principles of faith written in a single book. It should include the foundations of true faith and the laws, both general and particular, that every person needs to know, so that we can educate them and teach them, each according to his ability, one day at a time, until they can make him, that is the former converso, aware of these main points. In other words, he doesn't want just a confraternity. He doesn't want people to just be involved. He wants a book. And he wants the book to spell it out, because the book will do it right. Because if your neighbor comes to you and asks a question, you may not know the answer. We need a book that defines what it is, what the halacha is, and this book will allow everybody to teach, and then everybody can go and do that. Now, it's very interesting. Let me just end with this. If you compare him... Well, because it's already been done. Well, he talks about circumcision at the end. Actually, there are 2 points. I'm glad you stopped. 2 points. First of all, he makes the point... I'm sorry?
It's interesting that he's not just interested in the law, it's the principles of faith.
It's principles of faith and law, but certainly it is the details of law, and he particularly goes on at great length about the fact that the unseen believe that so long as they are not circumcised, they're not Jewish. And that... No. As long as they're circumcised, they don't have to build the mitzvah. Well, that's actually... No. Well, but they believe that they are not halachically obligated. Right. And that their sins are not sins.
They're not culpable.
Okay. All right. Well, we can argue what that word means. But he decries this, and he goes on at great length to say, would you get off it? Circumcision has nothing to do with being Jewish or being liable for sin, and even people who are not circumcised for health reasons or whatever are still liable for sin, and the two are not related, and so forth and so on. And we have to eradicate this idea from the minds of the thing. And he tells a very interesting story. I know people who didn't get themselves circumcised, arguing they had to go back to Spain to get their family, and you know what? They drowned on the way back to Spain. And that's their punishment for not getting... This is sort of an unreal understanding of the people. But that's the kind of view he says.
Understanding of the popular conception that until you're circumcised, you're not...
Well, he at least emphasizes it. Having said that, at the end he comes back to the theme of ma'aseh and limud, of learning and action. And he ends on the idea that all your learning, in other words, you rabbis who are doing your studying and giving your sermons and beautiful, if it doesn't lead to actual involvement with the people and actual creating of the holy community, your learning isn't much. So now we understand the point of the original dichotomy with which the chapter started, the dichotomy of learning and deed. He basically ends up turning to the rabbis and saying, your learning is not enough. Your elaborate sermons, your cutesy little sermons with all of your divrei Torah and your cute insights are nothing if you do not get the community to behave. So it seems to me, is the end. He also throws in here, he manages to throw in that he doesn't like the claim that many of the Anusim make that they are shogigim. That is, that they sinned in innocence. He said, would that it were true. Believe me, they know, and they're sinning over there in those lands, and they can get out sooner. And he is asking for a higher level of behavioral normativeness than it seems to me anybody else in his period was asking for. And that's the thing. So it seems to me that this raises quite a few issues that are indeed characteristic of the early modern period. Let me just add one thing. I wrote an article many years ago about a guy named Eliyahu Montalto. And Montalto came out of Portugal at the beginning of, well, not the beginning of our period, but at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. And when he comes out, the thrust of, he is a polemicist. He is well known in the Marrano community or the Converso community as a defender of Judaism, but his defense of Judaism is that it is a rational faith, that Christianity is irrational. And he argues that only the rational and everything about Judaism is rational and open. And what he is clearly fighting is the relativism that exists in the community of his peers. He says, you people all, you say the Goyim tell us one thing, the priests tell us one thing, the rabbi tells us another thing. He says, people say, we don't know which to believe. Montalto says, no, you have to believe the rabbi. It's obvious the rabbi has no stake in it. The priest is making money off you. The king is making money off you. He has a big stake in his religion, but everybody knows that rabbis are so poor that clearly if they tell you this is the truth, it must be the truth because they have no balance. But the point is, it may sound cute, but the point is that the community of conversos at the beginning of the 16th century is suffering from relativism, and the answer to that is a dedication to rationalism. By the end, or by the second third of the 17th century, as Kaplan showed in dealing with Orobio and with what's the changes in Amsterdam, but we can see it in Italy as well, what has happened is the response to the converso experience is no longer rationalism. It is ritualistic rigor. It is that essential view of Judaism, that return to it, that holding up of behavioral norms as the way to go. Yeah? Sure.
Two points. One is, and this is just a suggestion because having been taught by Ann Orlovitz and others about Michael Haig's work, I would avoid the use of enthusiast when you want to describe this, because it really, to me, it now conjures up something much more Sabbatine, and I think you want to call it something else. But my overarching question really is, if, let's say he left out the stuff about the conversos. If I was reading this cold without a name on it, I don't think I would be able to date it to the early modern period. In other words, I would see something that I'm seeing over and over. No, just the last part about it, which I clearly identifies it as an early modern phenomenon. Right. I don't find anything, and I'm not talking about stylistic, I'm talking about content. This, hochech tochiach motif and haranguing and chumrot, I don't find, it seems to me that when you're trying to find something, or you're trying to say, what is early modern in this, that I don't agree, for example, these are some phrases, it creates or renders an image of an essential Judaism, creation of the static image of Judaism has to be found again. I think that's old. I can think of certainly earlier examples of the same, and so I wonder whether, now, my last comment, Banda, in her discussion, talked about the fact that maybe our notion of periodization is a little bit constraining, and that at certain times and places. I wonder whether, with the exception of this bit about the conversos, whether this does really look early modern at all. That's my
conversos. This looks very early modern, but Christian.
Okay.
Catholic to me.
It's not early modern. It's early modern, but it's Christian.
That's what makes it early modern.
There is a sense of crisis among some Sephardic rabbis in the 16th, 17th century, just as we see in Lucerne, that makes them say, how do they survive in Italy? It's precisely what they see as a conjunction of lowering of standards of ritual observance, lowering of standards of moral behavior, and the ignorance and possibly deliberate apathy of some conversos all together, that they think of this kind of poison glue that's underlying the pillars of Jewish society. So you have people like Moshe Chadjis and Samuel Aboab and several others, yes, who are up in arms, and they all come out with similar background.
Well, Louis Horowitz wrote an article about the rituals of the Eve of Circumcision, in which he traced how these observances developed. And if I recall correctly, he said that in the 18th century, they started becoming much more bookish about it and ritualistic about it and less popular. And all of the complaints that he's voicing here ring in my mind as justifications for what Eliot showed rabbis were actually doing, except 100 years later. So my question is, can you notice things in some way?
If I can interject, the timing is...
Oh, you're right.
Timing is precise. Namely, the first voice we have in Italy against the wild partying of the Eve of the Circumcision is Arno Fontina in the early 17th century. And then afterwards, the community, so it's first the rabbis say it should be done, it should say the Zohar and 7 communities come in the 18th century and enforce that. But in terms of the rabbis trying to turn the clock back on an earlier period of greater permissiveness, it's precisely this period. And it's closer to the Counter-Reformation. So, technology works.
I just wonder whether maybe one thing that's going on here is there's a kind of hidden criticism of the rabbis. The rabbis aren't doing enough. There's a rabbinical crisis about the Jews. There's a problem with the function of the rabbis. He's got to go and tell them what they should be doing. That's not just Venetian or Sephardic, that's throughout Europe.
But it's the function of that's why I see this Christian, and what the function of the priest. And look at the last paragraph. This is so striking. Lord demands actions from us. Study is secondary. There are those who rebelled against the light and acquired the world to come in a single moment, dying in purity. They earned this high status only because of actions, and we know from, as we know from our Talmud, not one of them earned this through intensive study of the halacha or by giving a sermon. And this is strikingly Catholic. You don't need to study. You have the rabbi who is supposed to, like the priest who is supposed to supervise the community, make sure that they are all in line. This is very much...
No, the critique of the moral status of the rabbis is general.
Let me
respond, and then
there's just a couple of minutes. So let me see if I can make a general response which won't answer any things. I accept all of the things, and in fact all of these things, or many of them, were things that were running through my head as I was doing it, and I agree. But let me see if I can suggest something that I already tried yesterday and people looked at me and said, you're wrong. The fact that something is not new, to take up what you said, the fact that we find certain themes. I don't expect in the early modern period to have new ideas suddenly pop up. What I am looking for is the way in which, granted the great chain of being, granted all of those ideas that are there, they're all running around, how are they brought together and what do they form in this period? It seems to me that he, in the way in which he treats not just the issue of hochacha, which I brought here because of its usefulness for social control, but in the way he talks about Shabbat, about stam yenam, about slapping kids, about haircuts, about everything, right? That he is in fact more extreme. I don't think you find somebody quite like him all the way. I mean, you can find individual examples of everything, but he is a package unto himself. Second of all, what I agree that it's not so much the criticism of the rabbinate that's important here, but it is the recognition of the institutionalized rabbinate. You have to remember, this is Italy. Italy has a tradition of you hire the guy, he is the community fellow, he has a responsibility to give a sermon and this and that and the other thing, but he has no supervisory obligations. The community is run by the community. Aboab is trying to create an image. Now, whether it's Christian that is, whether he's taking it from Christian, or whether in fact he reflects a new image of the rabbinate, I don't believe that Yehuda Aryeh Modena ever would have seen himself as, my job is to go out and check the shochet and the bodek to make sure he's doing his job right. That doesn't mean he wouldn't have done it as part of it, but it wouldn't have been the thing he emphasized. The third, one second.
That's in rabbinic contracts of going left and right.
Yeah, it's just not emphasized in this way.
Why don't you look at the other Sephardic rabbis outside of Italy who have a different position?
Okay, so
and then he compares probably himself to those.
You can do that, and the fact that there is also a spot connection with him. So. I agree, but I think there's still I think indeed, if you want to do it right, and certainly if I keep going with this, that's one of the things you have to really talk about this thing. But on its surface, I think you have something different here. The third thing that I was going to say is that I've recently looked at not Yosef Cohen, but at his father-in-law. His father-in-law, Avraham Cohen, they had the same name. It's an amazing thing. His father-in-law was the rabbi of Bologna for 50-odd years. His father-in-law is, in the first half of the 16th century, he is a Sephardi, and he is very proud of it, and he fights aggressively against people who would denounce his identity as such. He is a learned man. He's also a wealthy man, a banker. When he writes a tshuva, right, it's true, we can look at Aboab and rabbis outside of Italy, but if I look at Aboab in the tradition of Italian Sephardi rabbis, whether it's Avraham Kohen or others, Azaria Pichol for that matter, who is his younger contemporary, a whole bunch of these people, he is different. There is something much more aggressively controlling about his understanding of behavior. The fact that he was honored at the end of his, the fact that he was honored at the end of his life, and the fact is an indication that he spoke to a desire in the community that I think was specific to his time, and I think it is specific that he was honored and Yehuda Aryeh Modena was not honored. Yehuda Aryeh Modena should have been a great figure, but it wasn't just that he gambled, it's that he represented. Yehuda Aryeh Modena, faced with minhag problems, doesn't say, the truth is, and so forth. He says, we Italians had our own minhag, and there's nothing wrong with our minhag. He has this sense of losing a cultural battle based not just on his own knowledge or his own faith, but on the cultural battle between Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, and Italiani. He has a sense of a culture that is past. With Aboab, what you get is the sense of, I am building this culture, I am creating these walls, I am creating this strong society, this strong identity. He doesn't talk in terms of our little ethnic group. He is the Rav of Klal Yisrael. He has no doubt that he represents the universal truth. That in itself, it seems to me, is a mark of a claim that is different, if not from the rest of the Jewish world, at least from the history of Italian practice and thing.
Thank you.